Pakistan is going through its worst economic crisis and is desperately seeking an IMF bailout. Petrol prices have been hiked to 272 per litre and diesel 280 Pakistani rupees per litre. The government has taken these unprecedented measures to appease the IMF and secure a $7 billion extended fund facility. Pakistan has announced a mini budget aimed at reducing the deficit and broadening the government's tax collection net. A senior Moody's Analytics economist has said that Pakistan's inflation could hit 33% in the first half of 2023 before trending lower, and an IMF package alone may not be enough to put the country's economy on track. Prices of essential items like wheat, milk and poultry are at high levels, putting pressure on the average Pakistani citizen. The government could now increase tax rates to widen the tax base as well. Joining me now to take this forward are Raza Rumi, journalist from Pakistan, joining us from Washington, D.C., and Stephen Cochrane, chief economist at Moody's Investor Service. Thank you very much for joining us here, gentlemen. Stephen, if I can begin with you, give us a sense of where Pakistan is heading. Do you think there are worse days ahead?
It's going to be a tough year this year. I think there's no question about it. I think the first half of this year could be a difficult year for Pakistanis in general. As you mentioned earlier, there's a very, very good chance that inflation will rise further. As you mentioned, the price of petrol is going up, and it could very well rise further if there's a need down the road. And inflation is still very high for food products, basic products that ordinary households buy day to day. So there's a good chance that the inflation rate could rise to something over 30% in the first half of the year. I think the second half of the year will look better, that indeed if there is very stable monetary policy and continued austerity on the fiscal side of policy making, then we might see inflation begin to come in the second half of the year, so that when the entire year comes in, it might actually look better than last year. It might be in the low 20s. But that'll be towards the end of the year rather than in the near term.
Right. Raza Rumi, coming to you, give us a sense of how the life of an ordinary Pakistani citizen has been impacted the last few days. We're seeing petrol and diesel prices at record levels. Prices of milk, prices of chicken, prices of wheat are all at very high levels. How is this making day-to-day life difficult?
I think for an average Pakistani, especially from the low-income group or the fixed-income group, the life has been tough for the past many, many months. I mean, in recent days and weeks, to meet some of the IMF conditions, further price hikes have actually been announced. So, for example, the prices of energy, you mentioned petrol and diesel, which is vital for the economy and for everyday transportation of goods and services and of people as well. But, the rates of natural gas have gone up by 113%. And that is also to bridge the shortfall between the cost of producing and importing LNG or gas, etc., and the rate at which it is sold in the open market. Pakistan's biggest sort of bleeding source of revenue consumption or the expenditure is the circular debt, which is related to energy, keeping the power sector functional in the country. So the government actually buys electricity at a much expensive rate and passes it on to the consumer at a lower rate and subsidizes it. And the IMF has been asking the government to bridge that gap and rationalize these prices going forward. So I think that these prices are going to further escalate inflation. I think 30% or whatever is a conservative estimate, because I was just reading today that the new figures are 38%. And the food inflation for the past many months has actually been close to 40%. So as you mentioned, bread, milk, eggs, etc., All of this has been a major source of hardship for Pakistani people, and I really, it has a political cost, it has a social cost, and I think that's what the government is truly worried about. Yeah.
Right. Stephen, coming to you, it has been predicted that even with this IMF bailout, which looks difficult at this stage, even with this, things may not get better overnight. What is your view?
Well, the IMF bailout will certainly help, and I think the government needs to do everything it can to try to secure that bailout. Without it, the conditions would be even that much tougher. But even with the bailout, I mean, there's still going to be a need to, most importantly, keep an eye on inflation and do whatever can be done to get inflation back under control. Now, it's not going to be easy because in the near term, as we mentioned, there are going to be tax hikes or price hikes or subsidy reductions on a number of products. But all of that will lead to better inflation going forward second half of the year and into 2024. So I think no matter whether the bailout is achieved or not, it's just going to be a very, very difficult year for Pakistan. I think a few things that the government can do to try to ease these conditions. One is simply to work very, very hard to find more foreign aid to pay for the flood damage repair that's absolutely necessary from the floods last year. I think that'll go a long way towards also helping economic growth to steady as infrastructure construction would help, and it would create jobs and income for Pakistanis as well. So it's going to be tough in terms of managing fiscal austerity at the same time managing some of these flood relief programs that have to be taken care of as well.
Right. Raza Rumi, coming to you, the Washington Post reported how there have been 13 bailouts that Pakistan has received since the 1980s, but somewhere they have just not gone for those major structural changes that were required to reduce government spending, increasing revenues as well. What do you think has been missing from the economic program of successive governments?
This is a very important question, and I think a fundamental question here. The unwilling nature of the Pakistani political system to undertake structural reforms that are an imperative now. And now, I guess, with this crisis, they will have no choice going forward but to address some of those long-standing issues. What are those issues? I think the first is that Pakistan's bleeding public sector enterprises consume a major chunk of the budget, so there are big white elephants, that need to be either improved, their governance needs to improve, or they need to be privatized or partially privatized, the railways, the steel mills. I mean, there are dozens and dozens of public sector corporations which basically are a burden on the exchequer, and no political government wants to touch them because if they downsize or rationalize their workings, they will have to lay off people. So that's one part. The other is, of course, defense expenditure, which has also not really seen any decrease. I mean, it was frozen in the last budget. I mean, that's what the government claimed. But, it is also important for Pakistan to review. And some of the economists have argued that some of the wasteful expenditure in the public sector, both in the defense sector as well in the civilian bureaucracy, needs to be trimmed down. And then, of course, the power sector that I mentioned earlier. Almost 20 to 30% of line losses have been reported in power distribution. So until you don't fix some of these issues, and you're not going to, stabilize in the longer run. I mean, IMF bailouts are just temporary sort of injections that Pakistan is now used to, and I think this one also will give a reprieve for a couple of months, and then in about 4 to 6 months, Pakistan will be back in the same situation until it really doesn't cut down its expenditures. But for all of this, what is important to remember is that you cannot bring about these reforms without a bipartisan consensus, without a political consensus and political stability. In Pakistan, governments are frequently changed. There's still turmoil going on the street. I mean, for much of last year, the opposition leader Imran Khan was protesting on the streets. Now he wants an early election, and the government doesn't want to go into election. So there's always this political instability that prevents arriving at a consensus on key policy reforms that are urgently needed. And final point, why all of this is has become so critical, with foreign exchange reserves dipping to nearly $3 billion or so, is also the fact that the Western assistance to Pakistan has declined tremendously. For decades, Pakistan has been, used to being part of the U.S. global security project, where either it's the Cold War or the Afghanistan war or the war on terror, and it was getting all these handouts, lots and lots of foreign exchange for its services in these projects. I mean, they're no longer coming until, of course, U.S. starts bombing another country in the neighborhood, maybe, but God forbid. So I guess what Pakistan's elites need to realize is that they have to wake up to a new reality, a new geopolitical order, and
Right.
also think of trading with India, trading with Iran, trading with China and other parts. I mean, it is an imperative now, without which you cannot really think of long-term solution.
Right. Stephen, my final questions now to both our panelists. Stephen, starting with you, what is the danger of an economy like this for the Southeast Asian region, for the world as well, according to you?
Well, there's a couple of dangers. First, of course, just for Pakistan itself, if these issues cannot be managed, and one of the first problems is simply not having enough foreign exchange to bring in the imported goods that are needed to survive. That's a very near-term problem. And then if these issues lead to a rise in poverty rates and then a rise in social instability, that's something that can not only hurt Pakistan itself, but bleed to other regions of the world. So stability and the idea, as mentioned earlier, that these structural reforms take a really long-term effort to attain is really critically important in trying to avoid these kinds of issues. I think in the near term, one of the advantages in terms of the global economy is that the Chinese economy is going to be accelerating this coming year, next year, as it comes out of its zero COVID policy. That will create opportunities for trade and for somewhat stronger global growth. It's a very good time to be working on policies that extend linkages through global trade and inward investment into Pakistan.
All right, we've run out of time, but Stephen Cochrane, Raza Rumi, thank you very much for joining us for that insightful discussion on the state of the Pakistani economy right now. Of course, what's happening in India's neighborhood is extremely important, and India, of course, is looking at the situation in Pakistan very, very closely and carefully as well. Raza Rumi, Stephen Cochrane, thank you very much for joining us. We take a break here, but when we turn our focus to China, from the spy balloon row to the U.S. Senate's resolution on Arunachal Pradesh. That and much more with Brahma Chalane when we're back. Global Eye, U.S. shooting of a Chinese spy balloon has worsened tensions between U.S. and China. President Biden has said he intends to speak to President Xi about the issue, but is not apologetic about shooting down the balloon. China, as a countermeasure, sanctioned Lockheed Martin and Raytheon missiles and defense. In the meanwhile, a bipartisan resolution has been moved in the U.S. Senate stating that Arunachal Pradesh is a part of India. This comes at a time when India and China continue to be locked in a boundary dispute. India has also this week made some key announcements to ramp up boundary infrastructure. Joining us right now is well-known foreign policy expert on China, Brahma Chalane. Brahma Chalane, thank you very much for joining us. How do you see this Spy balloon controversy, worsening relationship between the U.S. and China. Biden making very clear he will take it up, but he doesn't want to start another Cold War.
You're right. The flight of a Chinese spy balloon across the U.S. for 4 days before it was shot down has put into stark relief the fact that a rising China, not a declining Russia, poses the biggest threat to America. Biden is facing a lot of flack at home for having waited 4 days before ordering the downing of the Chinese spy balloon. By contrast, he was quick to order the downing of 3 unidentified aerial objects that were noticed subsequent to the Chinese reconnaissance balloon. So in this context, it's significant that Biden has announced that he intends to speak with Chinese President Xi Jinping to keep lines of communication open, and that this weekend at the Munich Security Conference, Anthony Blinken could meet with China's Wang Yi. So clearly shows that the Biden administration is seeking to ease tensions with China. In fact, in a statement, Biden says that the U.S. is not seeking conflict with China or even a new Cold War with China, and he has said in the past that his administration is not seeking to change China's political system. And see, contrast that with his position on Russia, including seeking regime change there, revitalizing the NATO alliance against Russia, fueling a new Cold War with Russia, decoupling the U.S. economically from Russia, and approving Russia's economic and political collapse. So what emerges is that Biden, despite the balloon episode, wants to maintain stable relations with China. In fact, his conciliatory approach toward China stands in stark contrast to his strategy of bleeding Russia in Ukraine by supplying Ukraine with increasingly sophisticated and longer range weapons.
I'd like to ask you about the India-China boundary tensions as well, because India and the United States have somehow been coordinating on China for a long time now. Just this week, Mr. Chilane, there were 3 key announcements made by the Union Cabinet, all aimed at China in one sense. One, raising of 7 new ITBP battalions, the Vibrant Villages scheme for 45,000 crores for developing infrastructure in border villages, approval for the construction of the Shinkula tunnel between Himachal Pradesh and Ladakh for all-weather connectivity. What do you think about the timing, the significance of these measures?
These measures are a response to the fact that China is engaged in a frenzied buildup of military capability along the India frontier. It's been building new military infrastructure, and the military standoff of China with India continues for the past 33 months. And that standoff is a response to China's encroachments on some key border areas of Ladakh. So given the ongoing Chinese border aggression against India, India is being forced to respond by stepping up its own military infrastructure.
Right. Those are important words from you, Mr. Chilane. But now coming to the point of China and United States once again. China has gone in for countermeasures. How do you think China is going to react further in the days to come, especially to the downing of the spy balloon?
See, China engages in activities that are hostile or provocative, and then tries to present itself as the victim. This has always been the case with China. It commits aggression against India and then paints India as the aggressor. So similarly, in the reconnaissance balloon episode, the fact that this balloon went thousands of kilometers beyond its stated course, as claimed by China, Yet China was not, was not apologetic about the fact that this balloon went over continental U.S. for 4 days and tried to paint the U.S. as having acted unlawfully by shooting down that reconnaissance balloon. But this is all showmanship. The fact is that whatever countermeasures China has taken or intends to take are just symbolic in nature, because clearly China was in the wrong. It was spying on American sensitive facilities, and the Americans downed that balloon, but it took them 4 days to down it.
Right. My final question, Mr. Chalane, and this is about the resolution that has been moved with bipartisan consensus in the U.S. Senate, stating that Arunachal Pradesh is a part of China. How do you see the support within U.S. politics when it comes to India's stand on the boundary dispute or India's stand vis-a-vis China?
The fact that India faces a hostile Western press, the Western press has become increasingly hostile to the Modi government. And there is an ongoing campaign to paint Prime Minister Modi as an autocrat or a would-be autocrat. This is a very unfair narrative. India remains a robust democracy. So given the hostility that India faces in certain Western quarters, this resolution moved by Senators Jeff Merkley and Senator Bill Hagerty, stating that Arunachal Pradesh is clearly a part of India, that India was within its right to do what it has done, that the United States recognizes the Mahan Line as the international boundary between China and the state of Arunachal Pradesh. All that is really good for India, because it shows that in the most powerful legislative house of the United States, that senators are willing to stand with India. This resolution is co-sponsored by a very powerful Senator John Cornyn of Texas, and it's likely to be passed given the bipartisan support that it enjoys.
Right. But thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Chalane, putting into context the current tensions between India and China, and also US and China, and how India and US would be coordinating in the days to come. Thanks once again for being with us. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Global Eye. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.